you all. Emil, hello.
Hi guys, how are you doing?
Wonderful, wonderful. Moore, I see you over there. Can't hide from me behind your name, I'll tell you that.
Hey, I'm in an airport, so it's kind of quiet. Or
Yeah, no worries.
quiet.
No worries. Thanks for joining. Camille, hello. Veros, what's going on? My partners are here. Wonderful. Jeff Rosen, Dan Von Cohorn, hello.
Everybody.
I've been waiting to do this for a long time. Paul Rajulovic, hello. Ben Narison, hello, Zoom user. Good to see you.
Oh, I gotta fix that.
Great to see you. Mr. Beck, how are we?
Good.
Another one of our founders. Great. Wonderful. All right, well, look, the one thing I can promise is these will always start on time, end on time. If you can mute yourself while we go through this conversation, that's great. We're going to open up for Q&A. We're going to go through about 20 minutes of questions and conversations, learning a bit about Brett, and then about 20 minutes or so asking some really tough questions to Brett that he has no idea what questions I've prepared or why I have prepared them. But I can tell you all, this has been a tradition of ours at Broom for nearly 2 years. And I'll go into that founding story onto these leadership conversations for breakfast, and it's all happened very organically. And now it's just time that we invited others to join us on the topics that we talk about. This is going to be a very real conversation. Brett is the ultimate investment banker, unbanker. So I've never met someone who is as an unbanker as Brett, which is why he's been a late stage person from an investment standpoint his entire life, yet he's the vice chairman of a very early pre-seed seeds fund, which right there goes against the grain and the traditions from the late stage investment folks. And then I can tell you this, the latter part of the TLC kind of focused conversations, for those of you on the call, you all know that I believe very deeply, and so does the fund. It's a part of our thesis that teams, leadership, and culture is the most shaping force inside of any company, early stage, mid stage, late stage, doesn't matter, post IPO, everything can be attributed to the success of teams, the leaders at that company, and the culture they hope to create from the earliest stages. So I'm gonna ask everybody for some logistical things. We don't care if you're on camera or if you're off camera, we just care that you're here. We're glad you're here. We're gonna open up for the last 20 minutes for straight Q&A. There are people that, bang down Brett's door to get on his calendar, and I have been lucky and blessed to be able to spend every Friday with him for 1 hour. The only calls he has ever missed has been to do college visits for his children, or there was a death in his family. Every other call he has been on. So he's a man of his word. I look up to him. He's been a mentor to me as I entered into the venture space and launched, Fund One with Dan and Jeff. And now we're here to get to know him as our vice chairman a little more intimately. And I'm glad everyone decided to come here. So stay on mute. At the end, we'll be able to ask questions. If you decide to throw a party or have a meeting in the middle of this, that's totally fine. Just go take yourself off screen, so we're not watching you conquer the world in the background, because we all know people are busy. So with that being said, Brett, this is the first time we've ever had this conversation with onlookers.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because this is our normal slot. We've been doing it, as Joe mentioned, for 2 years. And one of the notions was ultimately to make it part of the benefit of being part of the Broom family, both from an LP perspective, but also our founders, our executives, people in our network of really expanding this. So it's exciting to have so many of the management teams and founders on the call. And I see Ben Narison as well. We've had some great discussions with. He's a great investor. So it's a really exciting network. And that's been, I think, one of the original theses here, and we're seeing it come to life.
100%. So look, these conversations, when we vet people out, because this was one of the first pieces of advice and opinions that I had from several investors that I interviewed even before meeting Brett, which was, hey, Joe, you don't just need to choose your entrepreneurs wisely, you also have to choose your investors wisely. And everything we're talking about today is so applicable. Like, remember, Broom is a startup too, right? We're a first fund. We're earning our stripes as we go. And with our founders on the call, I know you all believe this as well. You have to choose your investors wisely. And because I was, very new and green and wanted to build the right thing that was special from the very beginning, Dan, Jeff, and I sat down and were like, what is the archetype of person we want to take money from? Like, what do they believe in? And what have they done in their life to create meaning and impact, not just from a for-profit side, but just in a life perspective in both life and work. We need good people to be part of a good fund, truly from the beginning. And when I was talking to Brett about this, it's ironic how we first met. Our call that was scheduled, I was going to pitch him the fund, Broom, and what we believe. And I was telling him how disappointed I was. I was in a really salty position because we were vetting someone out for the vice chairman role. Turned out to be a disaster. And for the founders on the call, for the execs on the call, for the investors on the call, you've all done this, where you get really excited about someone and they present themselves really well. You dig in just a little bit more, where there's smoke, there's a little more smoke, and then there's a fire. And then when I heard the actual fire commentary from a due diligence call on someone who had worked directly with this person, unfortunately, it just was a letdown, and it's not someone that we could have allowed into the ecosystem. It was a character issue, more of a violation. And for us as a fund, maybe not for everybody, but for us as a fund. And so I was kind of telling Brett about this, that, we were vetting for this vice chairman position, and it was the middle of the call, and I thought I blew it because I don't know what it was. I was nervous meeting Brett. I mean, his background is exceptional, and he's someone I really wanted to show well in front of. And he goes, let me call you right back, middle of the call. Let me call you right back. Hung up the call. I'm like, that's it. I blew it. I completely blew it. And turns out he hangs up the phone call. He calls John Skinner. 5 minutes later, he calls me back. And he's like, hey, look, this vice chairman role, tell me more about it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe he's considering this role. So I went from pitching LP, investor moment to like, if this person would consider this, it would be amazing. I get goosebumps telling the story. And it turns out that is what he was interested in. And we went down the rabbit hole and we started to talk more about it. And he goes, but I won't do it without my partner, John Skinner. And I have to come in with John, and we've done so much stuff together, and I think it would be really good for him too. So Brett, and that's how I'm remembering the story. And tell us a bit before we get into the first question of where do you come from. I want you to tell us where you were coming from with the interest to be a vice chairman of an early stage pre-seed seed fund.
Well, I mean, a couple things. One is just personal journey. I was in a mindset of creating a portfolio of really interesting activities, and you hit on the early stage versus late stage, etc. To me, that's what's always been really interesting, is being able to play up and down the capital stack. So just before getting to the personal side, I just think that's really where private capital markets have gone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe concretely. Two, I had seen, Joe, what you had done at the Honor Foundation, the networks you had built, the authenticity there, the commitment level, the ability that you had to connect with people who served in the military, venture funds, big corporate leaders in cities as you built out networks to help place those people. And we were involved, as you know, with the Honor Foundation. So I'd seen it up close, and it is an entrepreneurial exercise. I thought it was bold that you're taking those skills and that network, finding partners like Dan and Jeff, and then trying to apply something that I hadn't seen in the market, which was focused on teams, leadership, and culture before it's too late, when you're not fixing problems that are ultimately always going to emerge, for any growing business, but trying to address it right up front and making that both a filter on when you get involved, a value add to your co-investment partners, and then obviously the true sweat equity and the commitment and energy that you're going to put with the founding teams. And to me, that was just a really unique opportunity to take some of the stuff that we had done and bring it. And the reason, for those who haven't met John Skinner yet, John was leading our technology investment banking practice. He and I had partnered together for 15 years at Blair. He recently became CEO of PSP Partners, which is Penny Pritzker's investment vehicle in Chicago. They have an early stage element. They've got a growth equity element, and they've got some other pockets of investment. But he and I work really well together. Every conversation generates its own momentum, and we can increase his velocity. He's also got a lot of technology background. I was broader in terms of my sectors that I'd worked in, leading equity capital markets. I did healthcare, tech-enabled services, et cetera. John brought a little more depth on the technology side. And I think what we propose to you is take the same slot you were thinking about for a vice chairman in terms of, role, and just divide it in half and get both of us, as opposed to, making you guys think about it. Is it worth kind of doubling that up? And I just felt like the fund, you guys, and your founding teams would benefit from both of us more than either of us.
And look, here's something I want everyone to know. This is a lesson that I learned gratefully very early in my life. And whether you're on the executive team, if you're a founder or if you're a funder, you have to find gold standards in your life for sure. Whether you're in the fund side of the life or the entrepreneur side of life. And I think some people go a very long time in life without finding a gold standard. You have nothing to measure it up against. When you meet people, you don't know where they actually sit. And Ben Narrison is on this call. And, look, Ben took a meeting with me 6 years ago at a coffee shop. And I had never met Ben. And before I even met Ben, he offered to stay at his house when I was in town. He's like, I'll only be there, during this time, but we can at least, cross each other's path. And we ended up meeting for coffee instead of staying with him. I didn't want to burden him and his family with me to stay that long, but
I didn't want to take the really cold showers I warned you about.
that's right. That's a true story. Yeah, that's a true story. And 20-minute meeting, and Trina, his assistant, kept calling him. 20 minutes turned into nearly an hour and a half. We talked nothing about business, everything about leadership and the importance of leadership inside of startups. And now Ben's one of our closest co-investors. And for me, I thought to myself, this is someone who had been at NEA for nearly 15, 20 years, been an investor, been a founder, had exits. And he sat down with me for a 20-minute meeting that turned an hour and a half. Man, I hope I find more people like Ben Narrison. To me, that was a gold standard. Brett was a similar experience, right? This is someone who clearly has a lot going on, sits on multiple public boards of big brands. He's been in kind of one of those banking icons for a long time, giving me his time, his tutelage, his mentorship, and his attention. Time and attention is very important. So I basically measure co-investors, people that come into the fund alongside a gold standard of Ben. Ben is very aggressive. Tenacity is the name of his fund, and it's by definition, that's what he does. Brett, he as a mentor, as a coach for the fund, if I give him a 911, he's on the call immediately. He gives me his time and his attention. Gold standard on the LP side, on the investor. And I think all of us have people like this in our lives. I've literally put gold standards up on a lane. And so I'm proud to have a gold standard like Brett be a part of Broom. He took a risk on us. We were a first-time fund. We were first-time managers. And I think every founder on this call, it's going through a tough time, or obviously the macro environment is certainly challenging at the moment. Lean on your gold standards, find them, ask them questions. They'll be there for you. It's been very helpful for me to have Brett. And Brett, that comes from somewhere. You've had gold standards in your life, and people you've leaned on going all the way back to your 0 and 10 years, to your 10 to 20 years. Tell us some of the gold standards in your life from the earliest days that were kind of emotionally shaping for you as a young person leading into your young professional life.
Well, this might sound a little Oprah, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I know that's how the TLC conversations can go with Joe. But
yes.
I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and I was the oldest of 3 boys, and my father passed away when I was 16. So we had a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And up to that point, my mother had never worked. And my dad was a mechanic in the Navy, and then a mechanic for an elevator company. And they got married at 19 and had me at 20. And so my dad passed away going into my junior year. And my mom, instead of, putting limits on us or, hey, we all need to band together. She did that emotionally, but she wanted to encourage me to, follow my own dreams. And it turned out that a year later, I ended up, getting an offer to go play football at Princeton. And, growing up in a small town in Ohio, I had never known anybody who had gone to school like that. It sounded, fictional to me. And all of a sudden I was, there for a visit, and it was just an incredible place, and it felt inspiring to me. And like the whole world seemed like open and everything else. And, it was far away from home. It was, not the best time to have to make that decision. It was only 6 or 10 months after my father had passed away. And my mom was all in, and she was like, we will do what we need to do. We'll talk on the phone every day if you want to. But it was all about what was best, for me, while maintaining all the family stuff. The other side of that, and this is maybe the not as soft side, we were in a really bad situation financially. And the way my father died, we didn't get any life insurance. My mother had never worked. We had to sell our house right away. It was just kind of a scramble. And one of my motivations hasn't been to become, the richest person in the world, but it was to always have enough financial stability that those around me didn't have to make decisions based on financial hardships, because it's pretty debilitating, when you're always on defense, financially, and you're making all your decisions that way. And I realize it's a luxury to be in that position now, but it was motivating to me. And it wasn't about buying things or, material stuff. It was about that feeling of stability, because it was such an overlay for us. And so I went, from Princeton to my first job was at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. And it was very much about that, creating flexibility, creating some stability. I was helping my younger brothers in terms of their, college choices, and I was able to help support some of that even from an early age. And that was really what motivated me. Actually, I just see Dave Coolidge just joined the call. Dave Coolidge was the CEO of William Blair, and hired me right out of Harvard Business School. As Ben, talked about gold standards. Dave Coolidge has been one of those models for me in a lot of ways. The way he does business, the way he backs people he believes in, the example he sets, his involvement in the community. You use the terms time and attention, and that's how Dave Coolidge is, where, when he's involved, he's there, he's engaged, he's on it, he doesn't feel distracted. And he hired me out of business school in 1996. We still work together. He's been at William Blair for 52 years. He's an icon in Chicago. He's on all kinds of nonprofit boards. He helped me transition to some of the public board opportunities. But you have kind of models in your mind. He also has been an incredible family person, supporting his kids and his family through all of their journeys, regardless of where they've taken them. So that was a good gold standard. As you asked the question, he popped up right there on the screen.
Yeah, no coincidence. Here's one thing too that I've also learned when it comes to vetting gold standards, and I heard someone tell me this one time, and it always stuck with me. You should partner with and choose mentors and coaches for people that you would trade places with at the snap of a finger. And now they went on to explain the context there, meaning I don't want to snap my fingers and have the background that Dave Coolidge has, or be in Dave's shoes, or earn what Brett earns, or have what Ben has. That's not the point. The point of trading places, meaning character, integrity, moral fiber, ethical fiber. It's Ben and his wife have one of the best relationships I've seen, and I watch them very closely. I see the way his children react to them. I'm a new dad. Like, I want to be around people that have like these generational people at 10 years old and 20 years old, and kids that are off in college now, because I want to learn. Life is a big part of work, and the people that can find that balance are very inspiring to me. And for founders, when you find people that are this gold standard, you can't just analyze the business part of their life. How people do things some of the time, they do things all of the time. And if there's inconsistencies there, it just should be part of the filter. I admire both of my partners. It's so great. Jeff Rosen just got engaged. Dan has 3 children, the ages 8, 12, and 14. Did I get that right, Dan? Am I close?
10, 12, 14. Yeah. Nice.
10, 12, 14. Okay. 10, 12, and 14. And so like Jeff gets to see Joe be new dad with a 2.5-year-old and a 9-month-old. And then I get to see Dan with 10, 12, and 14. And all 3 of us are representing these different seasons in life, but there's balance to it. And Brett has how many children and how many kids in college?
We have 5, 2 still in college, 3 now out, and 18 to 27.
Wow. And the reason why I bring up the family aspect of it, because it's always overlooked. When people applaud each other, they seem to talk about things like, and I feel bad because I didn't even follow my own rules when I gave this to Luke, who is, by the way, our analyst and intern for the summer. He's on this call, but he's helped set this up and is learning along the way. I forgot to put this on there. Current Vice-Chairman Investment Banking, William Blair, former head of Equity Capital Markets, William Blair, raised over $400 billion in private capital, executed 800 IPOs throughout his career, but we forgot to put on there dad of 5, right? Loving husband. Like, these are things that we forget. And I think from the LP perspective, from the investor perspective, from the founder perspective, find people that have somehow managed to balance all of this shit, the life stuff. It's not easy to find that, and pardon the language, but it's Friday and it's leadership for breakfast. And the reality of leadership for breakfast is life gets in the way of work a lot. And when you find people that have managed to balance that. So how have you been able to do that?
Well, I think it's a really important point, and it's advice I give to a lot of the young people that join our firm. Just like being a founder, being a young investment banker can be kind of all consuming. And I think there can be a tendency for people to defer the rest of their life. They say, when I get to X, then I'll get involved in some nonprofits that I care about. When I get to Y, or once we get our next round funded, then I'll, spend more time with my girlfriend or my wife or my family. And I think that's a pretty dangerous way to live, because I feel like the milestones and the goalposts are always going to keep moving. And when you think you get to X, sometimes getting to X actually increases the busyness. It doesn't decrease it. If it's the next funding round, if it's the next launch, whatever it is. So I personally encourage people to really think about early on, recognizing there's going to be trade-offs. Still keep a few things that you think are really important, causes you care about, time you're going to protect, a night a week that you're going to do with your significant other, or if you do have young kids, I'm never going to miss X. And have some rules. If you make every single one an incremental decision, that's when the job part can just obfuscate the rest of your life. And I think you take some intentionality early and mindset. And the other thing I would say is, I think people always view it as a trade-off. If I spend time over here, am I detracting from the job? And I found over time, and it's a lot of the personal connectivity points you're making and kind of the TLC element, people want to work with interesting people. People want to work with people who have full lives, who have things they care about, who are good, family people, who are supporting causes. And over time, as you layer that in, it enriches things. It makes you better at your job. It's not a subtraction element, but I think it takes a little bit of a mindset shift, particularly early in the deluge phase of life. The last thing I'll say on that point, though, particularly since we have a lot of younger founders on here, it doesn't get less busy in your personal life like you think it's gonna. When your kids are 15 and you're waiting to see if they come home from their first high school party, or they go off to college, and every weekend you're hoping they don't get thrown in the garrison, or they're trying to get their first job, or they have a relationship they thought was serious, and it breaks up, and they were making geography decisions around that relationship. Like, those are high parenting moments. You know, it's not just when you're chasing around the 2-year-old and they're kind of dominating the household.
Right.
So just kind of entering into it with a steady state mindset of how you want your life to be and building in some infrastructure and choices and time management around it right from the beginning, I think can create some longevity.
Yeah, the full life point is very interesting to me. As you all know, I come from a slightly non-traditional background of having built a business, founded a business, for some folks who have certainly had a different type of full life, right, from the special operations community. And it changed my optic a bit about what it means to be busy, what it means to be overwhelmed. And it put things in a relative perspective for me when I was going out and interviewing and talking to and looking at LPs. The one thing I recognize about that community is they have such a spirit of service that becomes so recognizable in someone's heart and soul that when you have a conversation with them, how they talk matters, language matters, how founders tell stories and what they choose to talk about matters, where LPs and investors go with their individual story matters to us. And it's why it took us 1,100 some calls to find the right LPs to be part of the fund, and it had to be the right people. And with that being said, this is a community within many communities. Why I was so anxious to start something like this, because I never really understood this is, and maybe some of the more experienced bankers and investors on this call and Ben and others will kind of snicker to themselves when I say this. This is a part of my ignorance. I never understood why people would put their arms around LPs and not share them. I never could understand that. I'm like, aren't you as an investor supposed to create so much value for your LPs that they want to keep you around? So I was like, why wouldn't you want to introduce them to all the new VC funds you come in contact with, all the deal flow that we see, all the conversations we're having? That's just a very natural, compass for me around community building. Brett has that 100%. It's always been additive to his point. Find people. It's not a compromise of a negative where you're getting rid of something, compromising against something. It's you're being additive by adding people who have these big, full lives. And so back to the gold standard conversation, Brett, an additive. Who is someone who has given you additive value that has changed the trajectory of your career? And I think I know who it is, but I'm really interested to see who you choose. Who is that person?
Well, so maybe a really good answer there would be a guy named Steve Frederickson. Was that your guess?
100%.
So Steve Frederickson is also an LP now at Broom, to the point of kind of involving people in your life in kind of all facets. But he was the CEO of a company. It's called PRA Group. And this was the first deal where I was the partner in charge. And it was 2002. And, he got everything I had to get this IPO done because I was going to make sure that first one worked. And, he's in a pretty tough business. It's like outsourced credit collection, and he does it in a way that is kind of gold standard in terms of regulatory and all the rest of it. He started it with literally a business plan, went out and found backing. We took it public at a $225 million valuation. It's now worth about $4 billion. He's still the chairman, and we've worked together for 20 years. I'm now on the board, but that relationship was professional. Ultimately, we did all kinds of stuff together, running, some trips. His kid ultimately came and worked for us at William Blair. We managed the money for the individual management team members. William Blair became a top 2 shareholder. It was one of the most widely held stocks in our retail network. We did 4 public equity deals, a convert deal. We sold 2 big companies to him. He calls me to invite me into the Honor Foundation, which I was already involved with, but just kind of showing that overlap, how kind of like can attract like. But he's also a great father, a great marriage. They value their trips together, long-standing relationships all around them. You know, that's one of the, I think, a really good indicator of the
Yes.
gold standard search. Do people have long-standing relationships around them, both personally, business-wise, you know, friendships, you know, and is that the way they speak? And he's definitely been that for me. And we're still, you know, as I mentioned, I'm serving on the board now at PRA. He's the chairman. You know, so this is a 20+ year relationship that started with a, you know, 33-year-old investment banker going down there to pitch, you know, his first IPO where he was in the main chair.
Yeah. It's funny. You also bring with the long-standing relationship. This is another reason why I love ventures so much. And I think it's why it's something I look for in founders for sure in our conversations. There's nothing quick about building a great big company. There's nothing fast, nothing happens. Everything seems to be happening quickly, but it's such a long-term relationship to build an organization. And you reminding me of this 20-year relationship and telling me that story with Steve, how it starts here, but you nurture is a word that I use a lot and the fund uses a lot and Jeff and Dan use a lot. And we talk about this a lot. You want to nurture the gold standard relationships because there's something unique about gold standard relationships when you found them. And everyone on this call, I know when you think of a gold standard example in your life, there's another phrase or term that is always paired with the gold standard, and it's all in. When you have a gold standard example, like Brett, gold standard example, here's why. He was all in. He introduced us to his network openly and freely, showing me the trust that I would do well by his network. I would follow up. I'd be respectful. You know, these are people that are important to him, so therefore they need to be equally important to me. He's brought me into his home. He was here at dinner at my home last night with 10 people. It was the first dinner I hosted in my house. He had to be there, right? So when someone's all in, they give you a feeling. It's a feeling. It's not some checklist. It's a feeling of trust and belief and value. That's what I felt from Brett. So I wanted to reciprocate that. And I know all of you have those examples in your life. And so this is a good segue into the values conversation. So again, you all have heard me say this ad nauseum, teams, leadership, and culture, but there's a prescription to that. And it's 5 forces: vision, mission, values, principles, and ethos. And when I see alignment in those 5 forces in people, businesses, life, whatever, I know that they're going to attract extraordinary teams, leaders, and cultures if they are aligned along vision, mission, values, principles, and ethos. And so, Brett, when you think of your core values, which I know you think a lot about, and Blair has tremendous principles that Skinner and I have had, of course, those Skinner philosophical conversations for hours about principles and values. How would you describe your values and how did you come by them?
Yeah, so, you know, on the work side, one of the things I've always tried to do, and it can work in different ways, and it sounds obvious, but it's not. And that is, I always try to give my actual advice. And the reason I say it sounds obvious and maybe it's not is I think early on in business, you're always thinking about what the other side wants to hear versus what do you actually think. And one of the ways I say that to my clients so often is I try to frame it as, what would I do if this were my company? Or what would we do if this was our company? And here's why. And really try to create some credibility by playing the longer game, because sometimes the right thing to do isn't to expand, or it isn't to raise money right now, or this isn't the right time to do your next round for whatever reason. And you just always give that right advice. And then over time, it just layers in the people who have seen you operate in different environments, giving true advice that wasn't self-interested, that wasn't short-term, that wasn't metric-oriented. I just think that really works. The other thing, and you use the term, I do like to bring my whole self to work, and it's a little bit tying it back to, you know, your comment about leading a full life. I've always tried to do that. I like people. I like to know people. I like them to know me. I like it not to be just in the work lane. Some people don't like to operate that way, and you got to respect it, but that's just the way I like to work. And I like to involve, you've seen a little bit of it, I like to involve my family, in my discussions. I'll bring them to an event like last night at your house if I can. Like, I like that whole person relationship, because I think it just has a lot more staying power. And it just makes things personal, more fulfilling, etc. One other thing I will say, and I think this is a good one for founders too. It's a Winston Churchill quote, or no, Teddy Roosevelt quote: "Comparison is the thief of joy." And, I won't go into the whole Instagram element of that comment, but in the professional lens, always comparing yourself to others doing what you're doing, who's making more, who's not making more, who got funded quicker, all those different things can really suck the joy out of life, versus, living the life you are trying to lead for the reason you're trying to lead, and not keep changing the scoreboard on yourself. I see a lot of people do that as they move through the phases. We see so many, we work with all these companies who go from, early stage to funded to a big exit, and their whole lives change. And then they just keep changing the scoreboard on themselves, financially and otherwise. And I think the root of that is this comparison is a thief of joy mindset. And, set your own scoreboard. Don't always, and I think you'll make better decisions.
There's you brought up a good point, and I want to get through a little bit more before we open up the last 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And we somehow gain people throughout this call, which is fantastic. So I want to say this: there's one huge element that I measure across my life, and it's because I didn't do this well, and I continue to improve at it. But obviously, as a 20-something professional, where my first Google search ever was how to be a CEO, I had no idea how to do this, let alone do this well. Brett has a unique ability that I think this really translates to founders. And I ask about, it's one of the first questions I love. Jeff Rosen, I love hearing him ask this question, because I know that this was initially a question that Jeff maybe didn't feel comfortable asking, but then saw the result of it when entrepreneurs take a minute and do the head tilt and go, you ask someone, how would others describe the way you disagree? And when you ask a founder that question, and they kind of tilt their head and look back, you wonder what they're thinking, and you can tell very quickly if they're full of shit, frankly. Okay, truly. And even when you ask others, do you disagree well? The question that you're really asking is, how would others describe that? And so if you flip-flop that and you ask directly, do you disagree well? They tell you their explanation, and then you go, well, how would others describe the way you disagree? And if there's a big, long pause there, there's inconsistency, right? And so when I think about that with Brett, not only does Brett, I know that Brett has disagreed with me. I just can't tell. That's someone who disagrees well. And he has this uncanny ability, and all of you should be thinking about this with people you keep to your inner circle, especially those that you feel are all in. Do they give you feedback when you know they're giving you feedback that doesn't make you feel a certain way? Meaning you don't feel angry or defensive, or you don't feel like you have to go on the offensive to get your point across. They just give you feedback in such a way where it's gentle, but yet they're giving you feedback, and you walk away like some Jedi mind trick just happened, right? Where you totally got what they're saying, you understand it, and you're like, yeah, that's a great way. Brett does that, and he does it really well, and that comes from years of experience. And I hope to be able to do that with founders and with people that I care, know, and love, where I give feedback and they don't feel a certain way other than they know that I'm being authentic. And Brett, where does that trait come from? How do you earn the ability to do that over time?
Listen, I think the first thing, and hopefully you feel this and others would feel it, I'm on your side. I want you to succeed. I want Broom Ventures to succeed. I want your founders to succeed. And if you believe that, you have a little bit of license to hear some feedback in a way where it feels like helping, not scolding. The other thing that I try to do a lot of times is I'll try to reframe. Like sometimes, you or a founder or one of my clients is struggling with something, but it's because of the way they're perceiving it. And if you can reframe it a little bit so it doesn't feel as an attack versus just a different way of looking at it from maybe one ring out, or depersonalize it a little bit, I think it can help people get there on their own. You can do that. You can do that with a question versus a speech. And the third thing I try to do personally, and everyone's got their own style, is a lot of times I'll communicate a little bit through a joke that isn't actually a joke. It's like a little bit of humor. We're kind of smiling while saying like, hey, are you falling prey to the rainmaker syndrome here, where you just, it's about getting the credit versus, you know what I mean? But you say it in a way that is like, hey, listen, I just want to caution you here.
Right.
You're falling prey to the rainmaker syndrome.
That's right. That's right. And to me, that's been incredibly valuable. And again, it's kind of like those folks that say, because look, I've had both sides. I've had people tell me I'm on your side, and then be horribly rude and disrespectful.
It can't be with all due respect.
Right.
Yeah. Then the whole thing.
Like, with all due respect, you're an idiot and you're doing it wrong. Like there's still people that do that and think that's like it's the preface to their advice and feedback. You don't do that.
I'll do this really quickly, but a really good example of this was I got a big assignment at William Blair, and Dave Coolidge walks into my office and he said, when I got the big job at Blair, I got into my office the first day and there were 3 envelopes sitting on my desk. And the first envelope read, when you hit your first crisis, open this envelope. So he said, I'm moving along. It's 6 months later, the first crisis comes up, and I open the first envelope and it says, blame prior management. He goes, the second envelope says, your second crisis, open this one. He is 6 months later, the second crisis comes up, and so I open the envelope and it says, reorganize. And then the third envelope says, third crisis, open this one. So he gets this third crisis, he opens the envelope and it says, prepare 3 envelopes. So, it was just a funny way of saying, it was acknowledging a bigger role, saying I've been there before, saying there's tools to address issues, but in the end, results are going to matter, So it was a funny way to have that discussion without sort of, patting me on the head and just taking me on his knee and saying, this is how it's going to be. It was a little bit of a we've all been there type moment. You know what I mean?
Totally. And look, before we get into the questions, I have 2 minutes before we jump into questions. And I know that some of these questions that folks have for you maybe have to do with the current market conditions, maybe have to do with, hey, you've taken 800 IPOs to the process.
Yeah.
I'm an early founder, but tell me what you've seen in hindsight work for founders once they arrive at that position. But I would say that if we can end on a universal note of your opinion and your take on how to, tough times don't last, tough people do. And if you could, this is a folks where we have founders on that are going through completely different journeys at the moment. Some are ramping up for a B series, some are winding down, some are ramping up, some are buttoning the hatches, some have to let people go, some have to bring people on despite the market conditions. What would you talk to them about and leave them with in the last 2 minutes about tough times?
Yeah, so there's a great book by Ryan Holiday called The Obstacle is the Way. And it's really to embrace it. So much learning happens, and so much reality comes into play. Listen, we are operating in a fairly unrealistic backdrop for several years, where it was just straight up growth and free money and availability of funding and funds being raised and competing to invest in your businesses. That's fairly unrealistic backdrop, and a lot more learning is going to happen here. And then you've got both elements to work with. So it's actually, I think, really instructive for founders at this a little bit of a tipping point that we've been in here, where you've been able to operate in two totally different environments. This one to me feels not V-shaped. This one feels a little bit like a valuation reset, a little bit like a sanity returns. You know, we've seen it before a couple different ways. This is more about valuation versus systemic. And I just think there's a lot of value for people who are thinking about the long game and just embracing it and not feeling beaten down and all. But this is what it is to be a founder. This is what it is to build a business. It's reacting to these things, and it's an opportunity to demonstrate it versus, you know, a wave that's going to crush over you. And feeling that way, leaning forward, you know, engage in your core. All that stuff matters now, and messaging and mindset, and you know, the energy you're giving to your employees, to prospective clients, to your board, to yourself, you know, those around you, and how you're taking it home.
Yes, thank you for that. And so before we jump into just live Q&A, I love that we still have everybody that joined. That's super important. We had one person drop for an engineering meeting. So here, this is how we want to do it. We still have 15 minutes. We also, and Brett, I forgot to ask you this. Do you have a hard stop at 10:30?
No, we could go a little longer if people need to.
Okay, good. So
Joe, I did want to address just the one point you made, because I would say in interacting with LPs and your founders over, you know, the last couple of years, that is probably the question that comes up the most is, how does the later stage perspective help with the founders and the earlier stage? And, you know, I would say a few things. I do think, and this isn't meant to be critical or generalizing, but I do think founders sometimes can maybe underestimate the entrepreneurship that exists up and down the capital stack, and within you know, more established businesses. And you know, we've worked with, you know, William Blair's reason for being is we identify, invest in, and support leading growth businesses with a real emphasis on healthcare and technology. And we've been doing that for a really long time. And, you know, when you think about some of the companies that we've taken public, it's, you know, DocuSign, just recent ones, DocuSign, and, you know, Grubhub, and Teladoc, and, you know, Peloton, which is beaten up now, but that's part of it, is you got to, you know, ride with people through good times. With Twilio, you know, just some really incredible businesses. Almost all of them are venture backed. You know, I think 75% are venture backed, and it's not like you meet them the day of the IPO. We've been working with them for years to be in position to be the bank that underwrites them in their IPO. We've helped them, you know, find board members and CFOs, and made client introductions and all the rest of it. We've also seen things that don't work, and, you know, when's a good time to raise, when's not a good time to raise. What trade-offs are you making as a founder around structure and board seats and downside protections and ratchets and all these things that, you know, you can build an incredible business. You get to a certain point, and there were features in the way you raise money that are not founder advantaged.
That's right.
The other major trend that has occurred, you know, over the last 5 or 8 years is there's been real convergence on the private capital side, where you've seen VCs raise significantly larger funds. They're investing later and longer in the companies that they invest in early. And then you're seeing overlap where you might have, you know, NEA, Ben's old firm, do the first 4 rounds, and then a private crossover round that comes from T. Rowe Price, one of the big late stage, you know, public equity investors, who's now increasingly doing crossover investments into the private markets. And the ability to move up and down that stack becomes really important as you scale your business, and knowing the trade-offs and what you're getting, and what types of funds are going to add what type of value at those different stages, what it means for exit. Are you building a company to be an independent business, or are you building a company to get sold? Where along the trail of private capital stack are you going to make those choices? A lot of those things are really relevant and it makes, the other thing is I would say is the public market gives you immediate feedback. And then it ripples into the private markets valuation. I was starting to sound the valuation alarm bells with you guys, in November of last year. And you guys, you were like, wow, there's, that's public markets. Well, yeah, it is, but it will definitely ripple in and it will start to, have an impact, and it almost always does. So it's a strange.
By the way, that advice had a multi-million-dollar effect on this firm. The
Yeah.
fact that we were patient with capital and we didn't deploy into companies that had outrageous valuations. And now we have reserve for the winners that come through in this market. So Brett is, that advice was critical.
And structurally, and I know Dan's got a lot to do with the portfolio construction element of Broom. Dan kept his discipline around reserve capital to back the businesses that need the capital at the right time. A lot of VCs did not in the 2021 time period, where it was sort of a race and there was a Tiger Global effect and all of that. So I think there's about, the last thing I would say, and it's the entrepreneurs are all around you. They just look a little bit different depending on where they sit. When I joined William Blair, we had 30 investment bankers. Now we have 700. We managed 5 billion in assets. Now it's 150 billion. We had 3 offices. Now we have 23 offices. We didn't even have sector orientation. Now we've got sector expertise depth all over the place.
Nice.
So there's a lot of business building in lots of different pockets if you look for it, and lessons that can be applied from earlier stage all the way up the stack.
And if I am going to introduce founders to bankers, I need to make sure they believe what we believe. And so that's why Brett's our vice chairman. He believes what we believe, and he truly is looking out. And one of the values for a company that I was a very, 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 very small part of helping create through a listening tour, and Stacy Scott, the head of people, is on this. One of the values they came up with was, we've got your back. And that's something they want everyone to feel all the time. Leadership, what I call absolute alignment, up, down, and all around, like we've got your back. And that's something that I feel that Brett always has. And that's a feeling. Again, it has nothing to do with thinking. I can think someone has my back, but I may not feel they do. And we all have those types of relationships. And one thing I want to talk about with Brett, and then we'll open it up to the group. And one thing I want to make a point on about Brett is it's very clear, because I came into venture, without a background in finance. And I went right to the history of venture capital. So I was that rookie. I was reading books on venture capital. Where did it come from? How did it start? And there's a great video about the origins, a movie called Something Ventured. And it talks about all these old school salty, which is a Navy term, which means you're salty in the Navy because you've been out to sea a long time. So when I use the phrase salty, you'll hear me say this often. It means they were the earliest, the Tom Perkins, the Don Valentines, like the old school VCs. Remember, for founders on this call, VC was born as a product out of banking. All of these folks were bankers and said, why are we giving business loans to these companies where we earn nothing? What if we gave them dollars but took equity? And there it is. Venture capital is born. It's really not much more complex than that. And now you have these firms, you have founders who want to stay away from big banks. They do, for the whole journey. I have learned more from Brett about early stage investing than I have in some cases from mentors that are in early stage investing for their whole careers, because he sees the tail end of it. He has seen how founders have been taken advantage of on cap tables from investors early on. And so do not be afraid. And of course, banks, when you find the right people, and the gold standard, banks are willing to give you all types of free advice because they want you around in the ecosystem, right? So I would encourage founders to have these conversations with the right banks, the right people early on how you should be structuring relationships and kind of negotiating terms on your behalf. I wanted our founders to have access to that. And that's a big role that Brett plays. So Brett, if there's any closing comments you want on that final thought, and then we're going to open it up for questions, and he can stay afterwards for 10 to 15 minutes.
Yeah, and that's the last thing I would say is I am available to be a sounding board for the Broom portfolio. And that was part of the idea from the beginning, questions, access to William Blair research, putting you in touch with some of our in-house experts, on whatever the topic may be, always happy to do that.
And stop, for founders, stop looking at gray hair as the enemy. It's not. It's not. It should be looked at as experience that you do not have. And you can learn a lot from that. So with that being said, if you have a question, how about we try to do it this way? I thought about this in my head, and instead of having people just chime in, just to keep it a little more orderly, type your question in the chat and I'll call on you, just so that we can have kind of an orderly conversation and Q&A. If you have a question, put it in the chat directly to me, make it directly to me. And then I'll call on that person as soon as I see the question pop in the chat. In the meantime, and again, be respectful that when we ask the question, I do want you to ask it live. I'm just going to call on you. Okay, here's our first question. Okay, we got a second question, third question. Okay, here we go. So Stacy Scott, I'm going to call on you. And so Stacy is the head of people at Tive. And as you all know, we talk about Tive a lot. They're becoming and are, knock on wood, just a massive success story. And Stacy was brought on board as head of people. And listening to the scale story of William Blair and knowing Brett's background and experience with IPOs, what questions would you have for him around people and people strategy?
Yeah, thanks for letting me ask the question first, Joe. This has been amazing. I have like notes of things that I want to use in my everyday life now. So thank you so much. One of the things that you said that I liked the most was that comparison is the thief of joy. I've never heard that, but as soon as you said it, it completely resonated with me. I got to people apps in a kind of backwards way through sales. And so sometimes comparison helps you be driven. How do you balance that when you think about competition? Because being competitive actually helps you drive things, but also being a team is important. And I think comparison comes into play there. How would you think about that? How would you talk about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't think having a balanced mindset in defining your own success means you're somehow less competitive. It just means you're defining your own success and not letting others do it for you. And one of the ways I see that come up, so Joe's big on the mission, vision, values exercises. And, we've done that at Blair, we've done it with a lot of clients. And whenever I see people suggesting KPIs or mission, vision, value points that rely on external validation, like we want to be the most recognized or the most this, but it gives the ability to measure to others. I personally don't like that. And it's a little bit like it's in that comparison thief of joy vein versus what do we want to be and how do we want to be and how do we want to do it? And you can take that organizationally, and I think you can take it to the person level as well. But how we want to be often means we want to really grow this business as big as we can, but we don't necessarily need to be like someone else or get someone else to tell us we've accomplished it, because we've defined our own success. So, I personally never felt it as a dial back on the competitiveness. I just felt it as I think people operate their best when they're in alignment and they don't feel like they're faking it and feeling that whole imposter thing and all that. To me, I'm always in best alignment personally when I'm going after my own goals by my own definition. And then to the extent I'm responsible for others because I'm leading a group or a firm, whatever it is, getting alignment around those goals that we can all agree on and motivate us and energize us. And I don't worry too much about external views.
Yeah, and thank you. Sorry, Stacy, go ahead.
I was going to say that's really helpful context. I didn't think of it in those terms. So that's helpful. Thank you.
And I know we hit time. We'll stay on for another 10 minutes. And I want to get to this question too. He asked it and then he had to jump. So, but he said, I'll listen to the recording. This is a good question from this person. It's one of our founders. he started it off with an interesting, 3 words and a comma. So as a banker, comma.
With all due respect.
Yeah, exactly. With all due respect, as a banker, how do you build trust?
I think it's being willing to give the why on the advice you're giving, because I do think the as a banker mindset is real, and you got to recognize it, that people are going to start from an assumption that you're giving advice that's in your interest or your firm's interest. And I think you got to address it. You got to give context for your advice. I think you got to give the why. You got to tie it to some kind of real life examples and situations and why it worked. And you got to be there in good times and bad. You got to show up when it's tough markets. A lot of people hide during the tough markets because they want to get the hard questions. You got to be available. That's the flip side to the lifestyle points you were making earlier is, as a leader, as an advisor, you got to be there when people need you. You mentioned the 911 calls. If you get the 911 call, you got to be there. You got to be there, and it's easier today than ever. The flip side of all this invasion of work into our personal life is you can balance it in a different way now, and you can hop on a Teams call from your phone while on the sidelines of your kid's game.
Mhm.
I personally like that. I feel it freeing, not invasive, because it allows me to be there, to be responsive when people need it. And you do that time and again, it builds trust,
100%. All right, final question, at least that I have in my book here. So someone commented, amazing hour. Thank you so much for including us on this. And tell us about what leadership means in your perspective, going through your career and your current role at Blair as vice chairman. How does that play into perspective of leadership?
So I'll take this maybe a couple ways. And one is, I think part of leadership is also stewardship. I think, when people hear the word, sometimes they immediately think, the Braveheart version and being out in front.
Yeah.
There's certainly part of that. There's also some stewardship. And, again, when I see Dave on the call here, his generation really selflessly transitioned ownership to our generation and leadership roles and all of that. And you don't see that often in business and or investment banking, for sure. Private equity, venture, a lot of times there's generational tension when it comes to handing things down. And if things get handed down to you, and that can be broadly defined, it doesn't mean working within an older firm. That can be how founders think about what they're actually trying to do. Are they going to be the founders that hand all of that success and root for the team that they're building? And there's a professor at Harvard Business School, Frances Fry, who puts out a lot of really interesting stuff. And she said a lot of leaders or founders have a mindset that says, if I leave, my business is going to go like that. But the best leaders say, the team I'm creating and the culture we're creating and the reason for being we're creating, when my time is done, it's time to pass the baton. We're going to go like this. And if you think of it that way all the time, you don't feel threats from your rear flank. You're not making decisions for any other reason other than to create the best thing you can do. And it's hard to get to that mindset. I didn't always have it every day of my life, and I worried about credit just like a lot of people did, particularly early. I do less of that now. That's actually one other thing, maybe on the general principles point, that is one of my guiding things. Credit is given, credit is not taken. A lot of people try to take credit, but there's no such thing as taking credit. Credit is given. And if you can keep that in mind, you'll have fewer squabbles around who brought this deal in, who brought this new account into our business, who attracted the VC, how am I going to get rewarded for it? And just trust that appropriate credit is given over time when it's kind of undeniable versus the biggest mistake I've seen people make individually is typically around the credit grab.
Mhm. Yes, I love that. It's given and it's also obvious, right? Where it needs to go.
A lot of times it's pretty undeniable, and it's also kind of undeniable once you've been around for a while if you see those who are oriented towards trying to take credit versus A, being very freely giving credit, right? Those who give credit around them tend to build loyalty and energize the people around them and create a different dynamic amongst their team. It's so important with earlier stage businesses. Is credit freely flowing around the organization, or do people feel like they're in a credit scarcity environment and they got to battle over it?
So that brings something else to mind. I posted something on LinkedIn that it's funny, it didn't receive a lot of likes or attentions or people reacting to it with reactions. I had more direct messages sent to me over this post than I did reactions on the post itself. So people weren't actually revealing that they were liking, disliking, laughing, angry face, whatever the hell LinkedIn does these days. But I received more direct messages about this and it had to do with empathy. And if empathy is something that we know successful leadership has within them as a trait or as a principle within themselves, and there's, the studies are clear now, leaders with empathy win, right? Which is why the vision of our fund is we imagine a world where empathetic, mission-oriented founders win, right? I want to back founders like that. And the direct messages I received was, hey, I in sum, it was all saying the same thing. Because in the post I said, you may be telling yourself that you are empathetic and that you're an empathetic leader. Go ask members of your team if you're an empathetic leader and see if their faces can convince you of the truth that you've been telling yourself. Like, I'm an empathetic leader for sure. I ask people how they're doing all the time. Like, that's not an empathetic leader, right? They have to feel like you're an empathetic leader. And so in your, you bring up these different things about folks that have impacted you, and Dave Coolidge, with a tremendous amount of respect, to join us today for the time that he's given us. I'd love to hear, since you reference Dave quite often, and he has he's clearly been a slacker throughout his career. So I'd love to hear from Dave, when you think of empathetic leadership, you've led an organization that through a massive scale around the world, and tell us about the best empathetic leaders you have seen and what they did and how they did it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and great session. Terrific. Well,
Great.
Our culture, I think, emphasized empathy from the beginning. Our founder, William Blair, I had the pleasure of knowing him, and we actually overlapped for 12 years. When I started, he was 82, and he kept going till 97.
Wow.
And he came into the office, but he stood back and encouraged all of us to, do our best and get involved. And he was, like Brett said, very warm and engaging. When I got engaged and got married, he had me and my wife over to his mansion. Blair family was in pretty good shape all along in Chicago. And but that was the kind of things he did. And I think his son, Edward Blair, who was the head of the firm when I joined, I asked the original smart-ass business school question, and they said, "What's your vision for the future?" And he looked at me and he says, "To make sure the firm outlives the family." Mm-hmm. And he was thinking right out of the box that this is something that you do. You build for the future. You don't build for yourself. You don't build just for your own family. You build for the organization. And then his successor, Ned Janata, was, a wizard. I mean, he was one of the best bankers, best everything, headed the SIA, headed everything he ever got involved with, mm-hmm. University of Chicago, Rush University Medical Center, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing, he was in his early 60s when he came to me and said, "It's your turn. You got to do that." Mm-hmm. If you don't, give the credit and share the wealth, it's not going to work. So I think I was lucky. I had great mentors.
Dave, thank you for that tremendous addition. So look, we're right at 10 minutes over. Here's one thing I want everyone to know before you start to hop off. This is the type of conversation and feel that I've always wanted our network to have with each other. I want Emil out in, Emil, where are you right now in the world?
In Denmark.
I want our founders in Denmark to know David Coolidge in Chicago and Brett in Chicago and Ben in San Francisco and Joaquin, where are you right now? Joaquin, I see you. Where are you?
Bogota, Colombia.
Bogota,
Yeah.
Denmark, Chicago, right? I want our founders, our friends, our favorites from all over the world to have the opportunity to get to know each other. That was the point of creating this community in the first place. So you can expect this type of style. Come ready to listen, engage, turn your screen off, take a call, hop back on. It doesn't matter. It's literally leadership for breakfast. Have a cup of coffee, wake up with us. It doesn't matter. But every other week, we're going to be having these types of folks on. And the next conversation that we're going to have, I believe, is July 1st. Yes, or July 8th. I don't know, look at the invite. I'll get it out to you guys. I think it's on the PS of the email we sent out. But we're having Rob Newson on, who's the current chief of vision and strategy for the Philadelphia 76ers. He spent nearly 26, 27 years as a Navy SEAL. He has every letter next to his name from dual PhD in leadership. And he is also an entrepreneur within the SEAL teams. He stood up 5 commands inside the SEAL community. He is a 90-pound brain. And if you saw him walking down the street, you certainly wouldn't think Navy SEAL. And I mean that as a compliment. He's the most understated patriot and hero that you ever could meet. And I'm going to bring up on the beginning of that call a story that changed my life in the way that I think about it. And there's only a few stories to date that have really changed my life. And Rob is one of those people. So I hope you can join us 2 weeks from now. Have a conversation with Rob Newson, who just recently revealed he also beat stage 3 for cancer without telling anyone about it for nearly 7 years. And
Joe, let me just say, I'm glad I got to go before him.
That's right. That's right. That's right. No doubt. No doubt. So this is a thank you and a goodbye for joining every other week. I hope to bring the network and the community together, nurture these relationships more, because that's what Broom stands for. So thank you all for joining. And I really look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.